I'm Oksana Afitska, and I am an associate professor in teaching English to speakers of other languages at Lancaster University, UK. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to give this keynote address, which I'm honored to do. Today, I'm going to be talking about how language can become a barrier in education and how we, as teachers, researchers, and educators, can overcome these barriers. Much of my thinking on this topic has been enhanced by collaborations and conversations with my colleagues at Sheffield University, Lancaster University, Sheffield City Council, Lancaster County Council, and local school teachers. On this slide, you can see the statistical data drawn from most recent school census 2023 for schools in England, and it shows the density of English as an additional speaking learners in the country most recently. So you can see that the total number of EAL learners, so we call them EAL, English as an additional language learners, is over 20%. The increase in the number of learners who speak English as an additional language, or learners who have come to England or who have been born in England, but who don't speak English as their first language, so English can become their second or even third language. So the number of these learners has more than doubled over the last 13 years. So you will see from this table, for example, that the number of EEL learners in state primary schools in England as of today is 22%, and the number of EEL learners in secondary schools in England is just over 18%, which is quite a high proportion of learners who don't speak English as a first language in state schools in England. All learners, when they go to school, they have to acquire specific knowledge, specific language to help them talk and understand the content and knowledge that is being taught to them by their teachers. So when all learners come to school, they already possess something that we call basic interpersonal communicative skills. So the sets of skills and sets of linguistic repertoire that learners can use to talk to their friends, to talk to their families. So everyday sort of basic knowledge about language and phrases that they can use in everyday communication. However, as learners progress through the stages of schooling, they start to require a more specialized, a more technical, a more dense language to help them understand and comprehend language content that is being taught to them by their teachers, content of their textbooks, and to be able to talk about subject-specific content and knowledge in various disciplines in school throughout the school years. So that second type of knowledge and the second type of proficiency, we call it cognitive academic language proficiency. And there are aspects of cognitive academic language proficiency that are common across different subject areas. So for example, some language can be used to talk about content or to talk about disciplinary knowledge in maths, science, history, and literature in the same ways. However, there is another set of academic knowledge or academic lexis that learners only need for those specific areas or for those specific disciplines, so they don't overlap with other disciplines. So learners gradually and naturally sort of develop this academic language proficiency as they progress through the years of schooling. However, if learners come to school with limited English language proficiency, they find it difficult to catch up with English native speaking learners in acquiring academic language proficiency. So it becomes teachers' responsibility to support learners in developing their academic language proficiency as they go up through the years of schooling. So let's have a look at the construct of academic language proficiency a little bit closer. So it is comprised of three big blocks. The first block is academic vocabulary, and that block can be divided into two sub-blocks. The first one is subject-specific or technical vocabulary, so such words as evaporate or food chain in science, such words as radius or square in mathematics, revolution in history, verse or rhyme in literature. So these are the words that are specific to those disciplines, and they are unlikely to be used in other disciplinary areas, but it is important that learners possess knowledge about these words so that they can express their understanding in those subject areas efficiently. Another sub area within academic vocabulary is something that I call cross-disciplinary lexis. So this is the lexis that is used by learners for stating, thinking, processing, and doing things in the disciplinary classrooms. So in mathematics and science, in literature classrooms, learners will need to evaluate, describe, indicate, use such words as criteria or section and other words. So they are cross-disciplinary lexical items that can be used in mathematics and in science and in literature and in arts. So the second block is academic grammar. So when we talk about academic grammar, this is the way that we talk about content in disciplinary areas in specific ways, making that content unique and making the type of talking about it unique to that disciplinary area. So there are some common features of academic grammar in academic language. So the first one is long sentences that are comprised of multiple clauses. So multi-clause sentences when several complex ideas are presented in one sentence. The second feature is use of passive voice. The third feature is use of modal verbs. The next feature is nominalization, when we turn verbs or adjectives into noun phrases. So for example, the word revolution or the word cancellation. So those nouns have been comprised from the words revolve and cancel. So the next feature of academic grammar is condensed complex messages. So for example, one lexical item, which is photosynthesis, can be used to describe the big and complex process. But if learners know what photosynthesis is, only one word can be used to refer to the entire process. And so the linguistic resources are being saved in the process of explaining or teaching learners new knowledge. So that also takes us to the next point on this middle section of the slide, which is clarity, which is ability to express ideas efficiently without overcomplicating them. So the third box that represents our academic language proficiency framework is academic discourse. So I refer to academic discourse as academic ways of talking and thinking. So this is beyond sentence level. So at discourse level helps teachers to support development of learners' higher order thinking skills. So helps learners to develop their cognitive abilities to understand content, to process content, to work with content, to develop their contextual knowledge and understanding within a particular discipline. So one of the measures that can be used to capture and document those processes is something that is called cognitive discourse functions framework, developed by Christian Dalton Popper back in 2013, which has been developed since then. But basically, this framework helps us to notice how teachers engage learners into talking about disciplinary concepts in a way that exposes them to progress in their cognitive development from, for example, being able to describe something or recall something to being able to analyze, evaluate, and create something. So this is what cognitive discourse functions allows us to capture, and these types of interactions with the learners at discourse levels that can help them to develop their higher order thinking skills. So what we have done, we have gone to the classrooms, to the primary school classrooms, and we have observed how teachers talk about science and how learners participate in classroom discourse in order to see how well their knowledge, their subject-specific knowledge is being developed in those classrooms, and what language actually teachers use to talk to learners about science. So what we have done, first of all, we have observed the lessons, we have recorded them, and we have transcribed those interactions. And on this slide, you will see us looking at academic language, and specifically at academic vocabulary that is being used in 4.5 minutes of interaction in one of the science lessons. And you will see that actually less than 1% of the time in that 4.5 minutes of classroom interaction, learners were and exposed to academic language. academic vocabulary. It is not very much. It's actually quite little, but in primary schools, probably you wouldn't expect much more academic language exposure for the learners. But also, let's have a look now, not just at academic language, so academic language across disciplines, you remember, so we looked at academic language here, across disciplines, so what such words as occur, specific, or topic, they are academic words, but they can be heard by learners in science classroom, they can also be heard in mathematics or history classrooms, so they are general sort of academic language transferable across the disciplines. So now we're going to have a look at subject specific, so scientific technical knowledge that learners need to have in order to talk about science in science lessons. And we will see that from this slide, we will see that in 1.5 hours of classroom discourse, only 3% of the time learners heard teacher using subject-specific vocabulary, and actually it includes words that go beyond scientific vocabulary lexis. So, for example, words as energy, erupt, plastic, polar, volcano, thermometer, magma, and lava are scientific words, whereas some other words like majority, maths, and some are clearly mathematic words. But it is okay. We can identify the scientific words from this list. But we can see the percentage is rather small. Well, you would say, well, maybe this is happening because it's only one lesson and, it's not really representative. So we have analyzed more lessons and we looked at the density of academic language, cross-disciplinary academic language in other classrooms, starting from year 3 to year 6 of Key Stage 2 of primary school education in England, which is learners age ranging from 7 to 11 years. And you can see on this slide that in year 3, year 5, year 4, and year 4, only around 2% of the time learners were exposed to general sort of academic language. And also here we have got later year groups, year 6, and there is a percentage of exposure is 3 and a little bit below 1.5. So what this tells us is it tells us that words from academic word lists were uncommon in the lessons that we have observed. So such words as occur or specific were observed only between 1.5 to 2% of the time. However, verbs and words and nouns that are representing everyday language or more specialized verbs, but not necessarily scientific words, were occurring much more often. So, for example, everyday language, so words like make, turn, put, happen were very common, and these words belong to the first 1,000 of most frequently used words. They were happening approximately in 80% of the time. More specialized verbs such as melting, pouring, freezing, boiling, which are less frequently used words, they belong to the second 1,000 of the most frequently used words. They were occurring about 5% of the time, and so were the technical nouns or specialized words such as heat and temperature. They were also occurring approximately 5% of the time. So what this tells us is that key focus in the lessons that we have observed was on developing learners' working acquisition of subject-specific knowledge through development of discipline-supportive vocabulary. So the vocabulary from the second 1,000 of most frequently used words, not necessarily the vocabulary of from the school subjects list. So, and there was not so much intentional acquisition of academic or subject-specific lexes. And I must repeat myself that this is the data that comes from the primary schools, and at primary schools, there is no firm expectation that learners are developing, that learners should be developing their subject-specific technical knowledge as a requirement. So it can happen, and it does happen, but there is no requirement that the lessons should be loaded with it. So let's move now on to looking at more data. So we looked at academic language across disciplines that can be used in the classrooms, and we looked at the subject-specific vocabulary, like scientific vocabulary. So we also asked our learners to highlight, we asked them to complete some tasks for us, and we asked them to highlight words that they didn't understand. And you will see from this slide that learners equally, English native speaking learners and English non-native speaking learners, they found a lot of subject specific scientific words difficult, and they reported not knowing them. And here belong such words as absorb, amount, amount of, attract, beaker, canine, molar, decay, condense, evaporate, evaporation, feature, growth, nutrition, producer, property, reproduce, reproduction, separate, type, vapor, and water cycle. And these are the words from the 8 topics that we asked the learners to do. There are, of course, many more topics in across the science curriculum, and you can see how keywords appear to be unknown or relatively unknown to the learners, and they report finding it difficult to understand these words. So clearly there is a need to support learners in developing understanding and competencies in knowing the meaning of these words and knowing how to use them in science classrooms. So what we have also done, you remember that on the previous slide, we looked at the 3 boxes that comprise academic language. So one was academic grammar, one was academic vocabulary, and one was academic discourse. So now we're going to look at academic discourse, which helps us to capture how well teachers support learners in the lessons to develop their subject-specific knowledge through development of their cognitive abilities to think about science, talk about science, develop understanding about science, drawing on what teachers say, what other learners say, sort of process that knowledge and take it from describe to evaluate or analyze or apply. Okay, so and there are different aspects that we looked at. We looked at use of modal verbs, we looked at use of a condensed meaning, we used at nominalization, we looked at clauses and other features. So let's see what we have found out. We have found out that there was adequate use of passive voice in the lesson that we have analyzed. So passive voice was relatively common, which is good that learners are exposed to it, so they can have examples of language to model from in their own language production. The same applies to use of modal verbs. However, modal verbs were used more frequently by teachers than by learners, but it is a good starting point, because if learners are exposed to modal verbs, and hopefully with time they will start also using them in their own language production. There was a lot of teacher modeling of language and directing students' language, which is a fantastic feature again of teacher practice, because it helps learners to develop their linguistic repertoire, develop their ability to talk about science, not necessarily in scientific ways, but everything has to start somewhere. So if learners can talk about science in non-scientific ways, this is the first step to start talking about it in scientific ways, given that they are given appropriate scientific vocabulary to do so. So teachers were supporting learners to speak in full sentences, for example, or they were giving learners sentence starters, or they were prompting them to complete sentences to elicit those linguistic structures from them, so that learners can learn to express themselves clearly. So we also looked at how teachers engaged learners with various cognitive discourse functions. And here you can see, so what we had in our lesson is teacher wanted learners to tell her what is ice, so how ice is made. So, and she was asking learners to describe the process to her, or to describe their understanding of what ice cubes are and how they're made. So, and the learners started by describing and defining it, and then the definitions were refined with the teacher. Then the teacher explained the whole process to them after eliciting some responses from the learners. Then the teacher engaged learners into reporting some more information back to her about what has been discussed. And then finally, the last task for the learners was to go and explore the temperature of different objects outside, so that they could then see how the temperature changes, or how objects become hot or cold depending on their properties. So clearly that teacher was doing a good job in the lesson that we observed in developing learners' higher order thinking skills, and this is a good practice. And again, I'm emphasizing here that even though the learners were not exposed explicitly or extensively to scientific knowledge, the knowledge of the science as is set in the science word lists, for example, but they were exposed to supportive science language, so semi-technical words from the 2,000 of most frequently used words, to help them develop their competencies in talking about science at the level at which they could at that stage of their development. And a lot of learners in that particular classroom were English non-native speaking learners. About 95% of them required this sort of level of accommodated language input. So let's move on to the next slide. And this slide shows us how learners performed in test conditions. So what we have looked at so far, we looked at how learners, how teacher exposed learners to content knowledge in the subject area through language. So we looked at how teachers use language, and we looked at a little bit at how learners use language. But here we are now going to look at how learners use language in test conditions. So we gave them some tasks to complete in science, and in order for a learner to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding in any subject area, they need three components. First, they need to understand the question itself. So they need to understand the instruction. Number two, they need to have the subject-specific knowledge. So they need to know scientific fact in order to answer the question. And number three, they have to have the language that they will need to use to demonstrate their understanding of the subject-specific knowledge. So if they don't have the language, and if they have subject-specific knowledge, but they don't have the language, then they cannot really answer the question, or they will have difficulties, as you will see later. So we have had an analytical framework that helped us to do this. So you can read more about how we developed the framework and how we have used it in our publication, which is shown on the right-hand side of the slide. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to find out whether the capacity of a student to answer a question correctly was dependent upon language ability and question trait. And we looked at different question traits. So we looked at difficulty, focus, requirement for active language production, presence of visual aspect, and also we wanted to see whether there was potential interactions between various factors that could affect learners' performance. And on this slide, you can see the analysis that we have carried out, and analysis was performed by the generalized linear mixed model. And again, you can read about the analysis and how it was set up and carried out in our paper. But on the next slide, on this one, I'm going to show you the most significant findings that we have obtained from our data. So the first finding is that English language learners performed uniformly more poorly than English native speaking learners, and the gap to their English native speaking peers depended significantly upon their assessment traits. So specifically, English language learners were particularly disadvantaged when responses required active language production than when no language production was required. So we can clearly see here that language is a factor. So learners, when they have to write using their own words response to the question, they find it more difficult than English native speaking learners. The second important finding was that English non-native speaking learners also struggled significantly when they were assessed on specific scientific vocabulary in comparison to their English native speaking peers. Having said that, English native speaking peers also struggled with those tasks quite a lot compared to some other tasks. So when the task required learners to name the process, for example, using a scientific word, a lot of the learners, both native speakers and non-native speakers, struggled because this vocabulary is not necessarily taught explicitly, or there is not enough emphasis on those scientific words in primary schools that learners get caught with during their assessment tasks. So it is important that those words become common for them, familiar to them, so that they operate with them freely and easily during the classroom, during classroom talk, during talking about specific scientific processes, so that they can learn and become comfortable using those words later in assessment tasks and later when they progress to secondary school, for example. So here are some implications for practice for the teachers and teacher educators that could help to lower down this language barrier that English non-native speaking learners experience, and actually sometimes English native speaking learners experience as well. So what we have got here, our first recommendation is to allow flexibility in the choice of language for the learners who are either lower achieving English native speaking learners or who are English language learners with lower levels of English language proficiency during the transitional and or catching up period. And here we talk about so what we mean here is allowing learners to use whatever language they have got at their disposal to demonstrate their understanding of scientific facts. Because in this question, for example, the learner said that the penguin has a fluffy tummy, and the fluffy tummy helps to keep penguin warm. So scientifically, the learner is right. They really tried to say that the penguin has feathers on its tummy, but the learner didn't know this specific vocabulary, so the learner had to say fluffy tummy. However, the marking scheme does not accept that as a correct answer. So learner lost the mark, even though scientific knowledge is there. The learner does understand how feathers help a creature to stay warm. So that's number one. Number two, we recommend start teaching and eliciting academic and scientific language from learners actively at lower stages of schooling, basically starting from primary school, despite it is being largely optional, and in order to prepare learners for better for later stages of schooling at secondary stage. So as I have already highlighted, learners don't know a lot of subject-specific technical words. When they go to secondary school, they suddenly have to know these words, and so gradual preparation and gradual acquisition of these technical words will prepare them better and minimize that gap and the stress associated with suddenly having to acquire a lot of scientific words when they are turning into the secondary stage of education. This finding is very similar to the findings and the recommendations by other scholars, as is presented in the orange box below. So it says that EEL learners perform poorly in mainstream classes, not only because they lack academic language preparation, but also because their teachers lack preparation to teach them this language. And this is very common. Teachers often don't know that learners require additional support with academic language or with subject-specific language. Subject teachers don't necessarily think about it because they are not language professionals. They do not necessarily think about the disciplinary area as something that requires language support, but it does. A lot of subject knowledge requires specialized language, and that language has to be taught to learners. So implication number 3 is our recommendation that when assessing or interpreting learners' subject-specific performance, we need to give them multiple opportunities to demonstrate their knowledge on one of the same phenomenon using various means, such as writing, drawing, labeling, speaking, discussing, and performing, and using various methods, such as completing combined and multi-level tasks, and consider this performance as a whole, allowing parts of the jigsaw to fit together. So when learner is given different tasks to do, they are more likely to demonstrate a comprehensive picture of their knowledge of a particular disciplinary knowledge, as opposed to when they're exposed to one type of task. So if you ask them to write about something and their writing is limited, then they are unlikely to demonstrate full depth of their understanding of the concept. However, if you ask them to draw and label, for example, then they may show more knowledge and understanding, or if you allow them to use their first language, which is our next implication here. So we recommend that English language learners who have limited proficiency in English, but who are literate in their first language, that they are allowed to use their first language for demonstrating their subject-specific knowledge in educational settings, because learners often come to schools from other places, from other countries where they have been educated. So they do bring subject-specific knowledge with them, but they obviously have this subject-specific knowledge in their first and their home languages. So denying them an opportunity to demonstrate what they know through the language through which they can demonstrate it is not fair, and it's not right, and it's not ethical. So learners should be allowed at early stages to express their understanding in either in their first language or in both languages, or to at least use parts of their or portions of their first language to support their writing or their speaking or their performance in English language. So thank you for listening. I know it was very quick, so I hope you have been able to capture some of the things and to remember some of the things that are important and relevant to you. If you have any questions, I will be really happy to answer them by email. Also, please feel free to get in touch with me. My email is at the bottom of the slide, so it's o.afitska@lancaster.ac.uk. Thank you for listening and have a good day.